The dead should not have known her daughter's name. The wind came hard across Black Hollow that night, dragging snow against the cabin walls in long whispering waves that sounded almost human if a person listened too closely. Margaret Hale sat alone beside the dying fire with a wool blanket around her shoulders and her husband's old Bible resting unopened in her lap. The clock near the stove ticked slow and hollow. Outside, the world had vanished beneath white darkness. No lanterns. No riders. No sound except the groan of winter pressing against old wood. For 10 years, that silence had been her entire life. Since Thomas died beneath a collapsed wagon axle on the North Trail, the ranch had become smaller every season. 1 horse. 3 thin cattle. 40 acres of frozen dirt and memories that refused to stay buried. Folks in town stopped visiting after the second winter. Some out of pity. Others because grief made people uncomfortable when it lasted too long. Margaret preferred it that way. Solitude hurt less than questions. Then the horse screamed outside. Margaret lifted her head slowly. Another sound followed. Hooves scraping ice. Weak. Uneven. She reached for the lantern hanging beside the door and pushed into the storm. Snow hit her face sharp as sand. The stable doors rattled violently in the wind. For one strange second, she thought she saw nobody at all. Then lightning flashed far across the hills, and the shape appeared beneath the fence line. A man. Half buried in snow. A dark horse stood nearby trembling with exhaustion, reins dragging loose across the ground. Margaret moved carefully toward him, boots crunching through 6 inches of fresh powder. The stranger wore Apache clothing beneath a heavy winter coat stained white from drifting snow. One shoulder was dark and wet where blood had frozen into the fabric. His breathing came shallow and uneven. Almost gone. Margaret stopped 3 feet away. Every story she had heard since childhood came rushing back at once. Raids. Burned wagons. Missing travelers. Fear had lived in these valleys longer than most churches. And yet the man lying in the snow looked less like a threat than someone the world had simply forgotten to save. The horse nudged her shoulder softly as if begging. Margaret knelt despite herself. The stranger's hand was clenched tightly around something silver. She tried to pull it free, but even unconscious, his fingers resisted. "Easy now," she whispered. The wind swallowed the words immediately. She managed to pry open his frozen grip enough to see a small silver locket hanging from a chain. Old. Tarnished. Familiar. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. No. That was impossible. Her fingers trembled as she opened the tiny clasp beneath the lantern light. Inside rested a faded photograph no bigger than a postage stamp. A little girl smiling beneath a straw hat beside a field of sunflowers. Emily. Her daughter. Dead 11 years this spring. Margaret stumbled backward in the snow as if struck. The lantern shook violently in her hand. "How?" she whispered to nobody. The stranger's eyes opened suddenly. Dark eyes clouded with fever but sharp enough to stop her cold. Snow gathered in his hair and along the edges of his frozen coat. He looked at the photograph in her hand first. Then at her face. For a moment, neither moved. The wind screamed across the ranch yard around them. Then, with lips cracked from cold and exhaustion, the Apache man spoke in a voice barely louder than the storm itself. "Emily said your singing sounded like rain on the river." Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Nobody knew that. Nobody alive. Her daughter used to say it every night before bed when Margaret sang beside the fireplace. Thomas used to laugh every time he heard it. The stranger's breathing faltered again. Margaret could barely force the word out. "You knew my daughter?" The man tried to answer, but his strength collapsed beneath him. His body sagged against the frozen ground as consciousness slipped away once more. Margaret stared at him while snow piled slowly across his shoulders. Every instinct told her to walk away. To saddle the horse. Ride into town. Let the sheriff deal with him. But her eyes kept falling back to the locket still dangling from her shaking fingers. Emily's photograph stared back at her through scratched silver glass. And somewhere beyond the storm, far out in the dark hills surrounding Black Hollow, a lone wolf began to howl. Margaret Hale had not touched that silver locket in 11 years. Yet now it rested in her palm again beside the firelight while an unconscious Apache stranger lay across her dead husband's old bed near the stove. The cabin smelled of smoke, melted snow, and damp leather. Outside, winter clawed against the walls hard enough to make the windows tremble. Margaret moved quietly through the room, feeding another split log into the fire before kneeling beside the man. His breathing had steadied some since she dragged him inside, but fever still burned beneath his skin. She dipped a cloth into warm water and pressed it gently against his forehead. His eyes remained closed, though his brow tightened at the touch like a man trapped somewhere unpleasant in his dreams. The coat she had cut away from his shoulder now hung drying near the fire. Beneath it, she found old scars crossing his back and arms in faded silver lines. Not the marks of some savage raider like the town liked to whisper about beside saloon tables. These scars looked older. Harder. The kind carried by men who survived too much and kept walking anyway. Margaret sat back slowly, studying him while flames crackled low beside them. His face looked younger in sleep. Maybe 35. Maybe 40. Snow still melted from strands of black hair against the pillow. The silver locket remained cold in her hands. Emily's picture stared back at her exactly the way it had the last morning Margaret saw her alive. Straw hat tilted crooked. Tiny grin missing one front tooth. Sunflowers behind her shoulder. Thomas had taken that photograph during harvest season 2 months before the fever came through Black Hollow. Margaret remembered every detail of that winter. The coughing. The medicine that never arrived in time. The silence afterward. She had buried the locket with Emily herself. Margaret suddenly stood so fast the chair scraped loudly across the floorboards. Buried it. She knew she had. Her breathing shortened. She crossed quickly toward the wooden shelf near the fireplace where her family Bible still rested. Beneath dust. Inside its pages, folded carefully between scripture, remained the old burial note written by Pastor Bell 14 years earlier. Emily Hale. Buried beside Willow Creek Cemetery. Personal effects included one silver locket. Margaret's fingers tightened around the paper. The room suddenly felt colder than the storm outside. Behind her, the stranger began whispering in his sleep. At first the words came in Apache, low and uneven like distant water running beneath ice. Then came English. Do not let her see the fire. Margaret turned slowly. The man's eyes remained shut. His breathing quickened beneath the blanket. Emily, he murmured again, softer this time. Run toward the river. Margaret moved closer despite herself. Who are you? She whispered. The stranger's jaw tightened. Too much smoke, he muttered weakly. Could not carry her fast enough. Margaret felt something heavy settle inside her chest. Not fear. Worse. Hope. Dangerous, impossible hope. Before she could speak again, another sound drifted through the storm outside. Hoofbeats. Margaret froze instantly. The stranger's eyes opened at the same moment. Sharp. Alert. Every trace of fever vanished beneath sudden tension. He pushed himself halfway upright with visible effort. How many? He asked quietly. Margaret moved toward the frosted window and lifted the curtain edge. 3 riders approached through the blowing snow carrying lanterns that swung like pale ghosts in the dark. Even before she saw the sheriff's coat, she recognized the shape of Deputy Warren beside him. Town men, she whispered. The Apache man exhaled once and swung his legs off the bed despite the pain pulling across his shoulder. I need to leave. He nearly collapsed when he tried to stand. Margaret caught his arm before he hit the floor. The warmth of his skin startled her. Burning hot despite the winter cold. You are not going anywhere, she said firmly. If they find me here, they will assume the worst. Margaret looked toward the locket still hanging from his neck now. Then toward the approaching lanterns outside. The sheriff's voice carried faintly through the storm. Margaret. You awake in there? The stranger's eyes moved toward the back cellar door. Silent. Waiting. Margaret made her choice before fear could stop her. She grabbed the lantern, crossed the cabin floor, and pulled open the hidden cellar hatch beside the stove. Get down there, she whispered. The Apache man studied her face for one long second, as if trying to understand why a lonely widow in Black Hollow had just chosen his life over her own safety. Then heavy boots struck the porch outside. The knock came again, harder this time, rattling dust from the ceiling beams above Margaret Hale's head. Wind pushed snow beneath the front door in thin white ribbons while the lantern beside the stove flickered low. Beneath the cellar hatch, hidden under darkness and sacks of potatoes, the Apache stranger had gone completely silent. Margaret could still feel the heat from his hand lingering against her wrist where she had steadied him moments earlier. Sheriff Colton Reeves rarely rode this far north after sunset unless something had gone very wrong. Margaret pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and crossed slowly toward the door. Her pulse sounded louder than the storm. Margaret, the sheriff called again from outside, open up before we freeze solid out here. She lifted the heavy wooden bar and pulled the door inward. Wind burst into the cabin carrying snow and the smell of wet horses. Sheriff Reeves stepped inside first, broad-shouldered beneath a thick wool coat dusted white around the collar. Deputy Warren followed behind him along with Eli Mercer from the trading post, his narrow eyes already searching the room before the door even shut. Sorry for the hour, Reeves said quietly, removing his gloves near the stove. But we have trouble tonight. Margaret forced calm into her voice. Trouble usually sleeps by midnight around Black Hollow. Mercer gave a dry little laugh that carried no humor. Not Apache trouble. The word settled heavily into the room. Margaret kept her face still. Outside, the wind moaned through the stable fence like distant voices. Reeves glanced around the cabin slowly. A rancher south of Miller Creek found tracks heading north before the storm buried them. 1. Rider. Native horse. Injured by the look of it. Mercer stepped closer to the fire, rubbing frozen hands together. You see anyone come through here? Margaret shook her head once. No one rides these roads in weather like this unless they have lost their mind. Mercer's eyes drifted downward suddenly toward the melting puddle beside the stove. Snow water. Fresh. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. He noticed the second cup sitting beside the kettle too. You expecting company? He asked softly. Margaret did not look at the cup. I poured one before realizing I had no coffee left worth drinking. Reeves studied her face carefully. Unlike Mercer, the sheriff still carried some decency beneath the weight of frontier life. Margaret had known him nearly 20 years. He had buried Thomas beside her when the church was too afraid of blizzard roads to travel. But tonight even Reeves looked uneasy. There is more, he admitted quietly. 3 men from Red Ridge came through town before sundown. Said an Apache man stole something valuable from them near the mountain pass. From beneath the floorboards came the faintest sound. A cough. Barely more than breath against wood. Margaret reached immediately for the kettle and lifted it before anyone else could react, forcing the iron lid to clatter loudly against the stove. This old thing has sounded like a dying mule since Thomas bought it, she muttered. Mercer still looked unconvinced. He stepped slowly toward the cellar hatch near the stove. Margaret moved before she even realized she had decided to. Careful there, she said sharply. The boards are weak. Nearly dropped a calf through last spring. Mercer paused. Reeves watched both of them now, something troubled settling behind his eyes. The fire cracked loudly in the silence. Then came another sound. Distant. Faint at first beneath the storm. Hoofbeats. More than a few. Reeves turned toward the window immediately. Mercer frowned. At this hour? The sheriff pulled aside the curtain just enough to peer outside into the blowing snow. Margaret saw his expression change slowly. Confusion first. Then concern. "That is strange," he murmured. "What?" Mercer asked. Reeves did not answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the darkness beyond the ranch. "Riders," he said finally. "A lot of them." Margaret felt cold spread through her chest despite the fire. Mercer moved quickly to the window beside him, but the storm swallowed most of the distance beyond the barn. Nothing visible except shifting white and the weak outline of hills beyond the pasture. Then lightning flashed far across the valley for one brief second. And along the ridges surrounding Black Hollow stood shadows on horseback. Perfectly still. Watching. For one long moment, nobody inside the cabin breathed. Sheriff Reeves kept staring through the frost-covered window while lightning faded slowly behind the hills. The shapes vanished back into darkness almost immediately, but the feeling they left behind remained heavy in the room like smoke after a fire. Mercer stepped backward from the curtain first. "You saw them too," he muttered. Reeves nodded once without speaking. Outside, the wind swept hard across the ranch yard, carrying faint creaks from the stable and the restless movement of horses somewhere far beyond sight. Margaret stood beside the stove with her hands wrapped tightly around the kettle handle, praying neither man could hear how violently her heart hammered inside her chest. Beneath the floorboards, silence. Complete silence. Mercer finally forced out a nervous laugh that sounded thin and brittle. Probably ranch hands moving cattle through the pass. Reeves did not look convinced. At midnight? In this storm? Mercer swallowed but said nothing else. Another flash of distant lightning rolled across the valley. This time no riders appeared. Only white hills and drifting snow. Yet the feeling of being watched had already settled deep beneath everyone's skin. Reeves slowly let the curtain fall closed again. "We should head back before the roads disappear completely," he said at last. Mercer hesitated. His eyes moved around the cabin one more time before settling on Margaret. "If you hear anything," he said carefully, "anything at all, you ride into town immediately. Understand?" Margaret nodded once. "I understand." Reeves paused near the door. Snow blew inward the moment he opened it. Before stepping outside, he looked back at her with quiet concern. "Lock your doors tonight." Then the men were gone. Hoofbeats faded slowly into the storm until only the wind remained again. Margaret waited motionless beside the fire for nearly a full minute after the sound disappeared. Then she crossed quickly toward the cellar hatch and pulled it open. Warm air smelling faintly of earth and old potatoes drifted upward from the darkness below. The Apache man climbed slowly back into the cabin, one hand gripping the edge of the floor for balance. Fever had returned to his face, but his eyes stayed sharp. "They saw the riders," he said quietly. Margaret closed the hatch behind him. "Who are they?" she asked. The man remained silent for a moment. Firelight flickered across the tired lines of his face while snow tapped softly against the windows. Finally, he reached beneath his coat and removed the silver locket from around his neck. "My name is Takoda," he said. "And your daughter saved my life long before I ever carried this." Margaret stared at him without speaking. Takoda lowered himself carefully into the chair beside the fire, exhaustion dragging at every movement now that danger had passed for the moment. 11 winters ago, he continued softly, I was near Miller Creek guiding horses through the mountains. A wagon overturned during the storm. Margaret's breath caught immediately. Miller Creek. Emily's wagon. Takoda looked into the flames as if seeing another winter there entirely. The river had frozen early that year. Smoke everywhere. Horses panicking. I heard a child crying. Margaret slowly sat across from him. Her fingers tightened together so hard her knuckles whitened. Takoda's voice remained calm, steady, almost painful in its restraint. I found your daughter trapped beneath broken wood beside the creek. She was frightened, but she did not scream when she saw me. His eyes lifted toward Margaret at last. Most people did back then. Margaret felt tears threatening behind her eyes but forced them back down. Takoda continued. I carried her nearly 3 miles through snow to an abandoned trapping cabin. She had fever already. Bad fever. The room seemed smaller now. Quieter. Even the storm outside sounded distant beneath the weight of his words. I stayed with her for 2 nights, Takoda said softly. She talked about sunflowers. About her father teaching her to ride. About how you sang while cooking supper. Margaret lowered her head immediately. A tear slipped free despite her effort to stop it. Takoda reached slowly into his pocket and removed something wrapped carefully in cloth. He unfolded it with surprising gentleness. Inside rested a tiny dried sunflower, fragile with age. She asked me to keep this, he said. Said flowers should not be buried where nobody could see them. Margaret covered her mouth with trembling fingers. For 11 years she had imagined her daughter dying cold and alone beside that riverbank. Now another picture stood before her instead. Emily frightened, sick, but not abandoned. Not forgotten. Takoda's voice lowered almost to a whisper. Before she died, she made me promise something. Margaret looked up slowly. Takoda's eyes reflected firelight and sorrow together. She told me if I ever found her mother, I must tell her she was not afraid in the end. Margaret Hale did not sleep that night. Even after Takoda's words faded into silence, she remained seated beside the fire with Emily's silver locket resting in both hands while winter pressed against the cabin from every direction. The storm had weakened some near dawn, but the wind still carried strange sounds across the hills. Distant horses. Soft movement beneath snow. Once, sometime after midnight, she thought she heard singing far away beyond the valley. Low voices carried by the cold. Not threatening. Mourning. Takoda sat quietly near the stove wrapped beneath one of Thomas Hale's old blankets. His fever had eased slightly, though exhaustion still clung heavily to him. Firelight flickered across the sharp lines of his face while he watched the flames with distant eyes. Neither spoke for a long while. Some griefs were too old for easy conversation. Margaret finally rose from her chair and crossed slowly toward the kitchen shelf. Her hands moved automatically through old habits. Coffee grounds into the pot. Cornbread wrapped in cloth beside the stove. Simple things. Familiar things. The kind that kept loneliness from swallowing a house whole. Emily used to hate winter, she said softly while pouring water into the kettle. Takoda looked up. Margaret kept her eyes on the stove instead. She said the snow made the world feel empty. Her voice nearly broke on the last word. Takoda remained silent for a moment before answering. She did not sound empty when she talked about you. Margaret stopped moving entirely. Outside, faint light had begun touching the eastern sky beyond the frosted windows. Gray dawn. Cold and thin. Takoda reached carefully into his coat again and removed a small leather pouch Margaret had not noticed before. He untied the cord slowly and placed several folded papers onto the table beside the fire. Old drawings. Margaret stared in disbelief. Crayon sketches faded with age. One showed a crooked cabin beside flowers taller than the roof. Another showed a woman holding hands with a little girl beneath a bright yellow sun. Margaret recognized the pictures immediately. Emily's drawings. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. She gave these to me while the fever worsened, Takoda said quietly. She said a person should never travel alone without carrying something beautiful. Margaret touched the papers with trembling fingers. 11 years of grief shifted painfully inside her chest all at once. Not gone. Never gone. But different now somehow. Softer around the edges. Before she could speak again, Takoda suddenly lifted his head toward the window. Every muscle in his body tightened instantly. Margaret noticed it immediately. "What is it?" she whispered. Takoda stood carefully despite the pain in his shoulder. "They are here." Margaret moved toward the front window and slowly pulled back the curtain. At first she saw only snow-covered hills beneath weak morning light. Then shapes emerged through the drifting white. Riders. Dozens of them standing motionless across the ridgeline surrounding the ranch. Some sat horseback beneath tall spears decorated with feathers that moved gently in the wind. Others stood beside. Their horses completely still. Silent figures stretching across the hills in every direction. Margaret felt her breath leave her chest. "Dear God," she whispered. More riders appeared as the light strengthened. 50. Maybe more. She could not tell. None moved toward the ranch. None shouted. They simply waited. Watching the cabin below. Takoda stepped beside her at the window. His face revealed no fear now. Only sadness. "My people believed I was dead," he said quietly. Margaret looked at him. "Who are you really?" Takoda did not answer immediately. Outside, a hawk circled slowly above the snowy valley while dawn spread pale gold across the mountains. Finally, he spoke without turning from the window. 3 months ago, men from Red Ridge ambushed one of our peace caravans near the northern pass. His jaw tightened slightly. They wanted land. Gold. Something to blame their greed on. Margaret listened silently. "I escaped," Takoda continued. "Barely. But others did not." The room fell quiet except for the crackling stove behind them. "My brother sent warriors searching for me after the snows came." Margaret stared back toward the hills filled with silent riders. A terrible realization settled slowly into place. These were not raiders. Not invaders. They had crossed mountains in winter looking for one man. Takoda lowered his eyes briefly. "If they had found my body instead of this cabin," he said softly, "many people would have died believing war had begun." Margaret looked at him carefully then. At the exhaustion in his face. The grief hidden beneath his calm. The loneliness. It looked familiar somehow. Like seeing another person standing inside the same storm she had lived in for years. Then, far down the valley road below the ranch, another sound broke the morning silence. More horses. Fast. Takoda turned toward the window immediately. Margaret followed his gaze and saw dusted snow rising behind approaching riders from town. Sheriff Reeves was returning. And this time, he was not alone. On the slopes surrounding the valley, only a few dozen Apache men stood silently, watching from a distance. They were not so numerous as to overwhelm, but each gaze held caution and concern. Takoda stepped out of the cabin, every step heavy from his wound, yet determination shone in his eyes. He did not shout, nor intimidate, he simply stood, weak but resolute. Margaret stood beside him, hands still clutching her daughter's keepsake, feeling her heart pounding as two worlds met in a heavy, silent tension. The townsfolk approached the cabin, faces uneasy and tense. They did not shout, nor raise their weapons immediately, they simply paused, watching. Some were fearful, a few frowned in confusion, not understanding what was happening. The air was thick with tension, every footstep echoed clearly on the snow. Takoda took a deep breath, straightened his back, and spoke in a calm yet weighty voice, "Enough graves already cover this land. No mother should bury another son because men are too proud to lower their hands. The gazes on the hills no longer carried aggression, only caution and attention. No shouting, no rushed movements. Everyone felt the meaning behind his words, the weight of mercy surpassing fear. Voss noticed it too. And somehow that made him angrier. You think mercy makes you noble, he sneered. Takoda finally looked directly at him then. No, he answered softly. I think mercy makes us human. The words landed heavier than shouting ever could. Voss opened his mouth to answer, but no sound came immediately. Around him, even his own riders looked uncertain now. Because for the first time since arriving, they no longer looked at Takoda and saw a threat. They saw a tired man standing in freezing snow trying to prevent strangers from burying one another over lies and greed. Then Margaret stepped forward beside him. Small beside the riders. Gray-haired. Wrapped in an old winter coat with Emily's silver locket still hanging from one trembling hand. This man stayed beside my dying daughter when nobody else could reach her, she said quietly. And every one of you nearly turned him into a monster because fear is easier than truth. Nobody answered her. Not even Clayton Voss. Above them, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting pale gold light across the silent hills. No one spoke after Margaret Hale's words. Settled across the valley. The silence that followed felt older than the snow itself. Clayton Voss sat rigid in his saddle, jaw tight with anger he could no longer shape into certainty. Around him, even his own riders avoided looking directly at Takoda now. The truth had shifted something inside the morning. Fear no longer stood alone. Sheriff Reeves slowly stepped toward Voss through the snow. You should leave, he said quietly. This time there was no warning in his voice. Only exhaustion. Voss looked toward the ridges one last time. Hundreds of Apache riders still watched the valley without moving, their figures dark against the white hills beneath pale sunlight. Not one had threatened the town. Not one had crossed into violence despite every reason to. The realization sat heavily across every man from Black Hollow. Voss finally pulled his horse's reins sharply. This is not finished, he muttered bitterly. Takoda answered him with calm eyes. It can finish today if men stop feeding old hatred like it is winter fire. Voss said nothing more after that. He turned his horse southward, and one by one the Red Ridge riders followed him out of the valley, their hoofbeats fading slowly into the snowy distance. Nobody watched them go with triumph. Only relief. Sheriff Reeves exhaled heavily beside his horse as though he had been holding his breath since sunrise. Then he looked toward Margaret. You saved more lives than you know today, he said quietly. Margaret shook her head faintly. I only opened a door. Reeves glanced toward Takoda standing beside her. Sometimes that is enough. High above the valley, movement finally spread across the ridges. The Apache riders began turning their horses away from Black Hollow in small silent groups. No cheers. No celebration. They departed the same way they arrived. Quiet as snowfall. The old Apache elder stepped toward Margaret once more before leaving. In his weathered hands he carried the blue cloth bundle the little girl had held earlier. He offered it to Margaret carefully. For the mother whose kindness stopped sorrow from growing larger, he said softly. Margaret accepted the bundle with trembling hands. Inside rested a child-sized blanket stitched carefully from deep blue wool and decorated with tiny embroidered sunflowers along the edges. Her breath caught instantly. Emily's favorite flower. The elder noticed her expression and nodded slowly. Takoda spoke often of the little girl beside the river, he said. Our children know her story now too. Margaret looked toward Takoda standing quietly nearby. He seemed smaller somehow beneath the morning light now that danger had passed. Not weak. Just tired in a way only grief could make a person tired. The elder placed one hand briefly against Takoda's shoulder before mounting his horse again. Then, without another word, he rode back toward the hills where the remaining warriors waited. Soon the ridges began emptying beneath drifting snow and pale winter sunlight. One by one the silent figures disappeared into the mountains until only wind remained behind them. By afternoon, the valley looked ordinary again. Empty fences. Snow-covered pasture. Smoke rising from Margaret's chimney into cold blue sky. Yet nothing felt the same. Sheriff Reeves stayed long enough to help repair the stable gate damaged during the storm. He worked mostly in silence beside Margaret while Takoda rested near the fire inside the cabin. Before leaving, Reeves paused beside the porch steps and removed his gloves slowly. "Black Hollow has repeated the same fears for too many years," he said quietly. "Maybe it is time some of us learned different stories." Margaret watched him ride away beneath the fading afternoon light. When she returned inside, she found Takoda standing near the window with Emily's old drawing spread carefully across the table beside him. "You should remain here until the fever passes," she said softly. Takoda smiled faintly without turning around. "You are offering shelter again after seeing what follows me?" Margaret looked toward the empty hills beyond the ranch. Strange how different they appeared now. Less frightening. Less alone. "I spent 11 years believing my daughter died abandoned beside a frozen river," she answered quietly. "You carried her through a storm when nobody else did." Takoda lowered his eyes briefly. Firelight flickered softly across the room while evening settled outside. After a long silence, Margaret draped the blue sunflower blanket carefully across the back of the rocking chair beside the stove. The cabin suddenly felt warmer than it had in years. Not because winter had ended. Winter still stretched across the frontier hard and endless as ever. But some griefs lost their sharpest edges.